In the 1920s, Major League Baseball games moved faster than they do today. They had more hits, more stolen bases, fewer walks, fewer pitching changes, and games lasted, on average, 1 hour and 50 minutes. But it was also a game in transition. On the one hand, you had sluggers like Babe Ruth and Rogers Hornsby, who might hit 40 or 50 home runs in a single season. On the other hand, you had pitchers like Burleigh Grimes throwing spitballs, and player manager Ty Cobb of the Detroit Tigers, who still embodied a 19th century style of play. It was an interesting time to see baseball games, and as for the ballpark itself, it provided an intimate and I would say superior fan experience to contemporary stadiums. Okay, let's talk about baseball during the 1920s, a faster, more exciting version of the game. The deadball era refers to the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The ball at this time was dirty, darkened by tobacco juice, and literally softer after getting beat up and not replaced by umpires. The pitchers influenced the ball's motion by scuffing it or applying saliva to their fingertips. Spacious ballparks limited the number of home runs, and all of these conditions favored pitchers and contributed to the low scoring characteristic of the deadball era. Hall of Fame inductee Kid Nichols won 362 games and he completed 95% of his career starts. Hall of Fame member Eddie Collins, who collected over 3,000 hits during his long career, created runs with well-executed bunts and superb base running, not extra base hits. Collins holds the Major League record for 512 sacrifice bunts, and he stole 745 bases. He was a tremendous offensive weapon, but not because he hit doubles or home runs. Pitchers from the dead ball era embraced a different philosophy. Many hoped to induce pop flies and weakly hit ground balls, not record strikeouts. Now, some pitchers were special in this regard. Walter Johnson was the deadball era's great power pitcher, an archetypical farm boy with blazing speed who averaged more than 5 strikeouts per 9-inning game. And he threw much harder, much faster than anyone else in the league. Christy Mathewson was another dominant pitcher who relied on exceptional control and a wide array of pitches to get guys out. And though he averaged 5 strikeouts per 9 innings during his career, he wasn't someone who blew you away with a 2-strike fastball. The modern power pitcher throwing 9 to 10 strikeouts per 9 innings of work did not exist until the second half of the 20th century. From 1911 to 1914, John Home Run Baker led the major leagues in home runs with 11, 10, 12, and 9 home runs. Walter Johnson called him the most dangerous hitter he ever faced. The nickname Home Run Baker was attributed to him in part because he hit clutch World Series home runs off Christy Mathewson and Rube Marquard in 1911. The difficulty of hitting home runs affected how batters approached the game. It made more sense to bunt, steal, and try for contact rather than hit for power, given the conditions at the time. The two best position players of the deadball era, Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner, were known for their exceptionally high batting averages and superb base running. They played in spacious ballparks and managed to stretch a lot of singles into doubles and doubles into triples. In fact, they are second and third all time for triples hit. Ty Cobb, pictured here, stole 897 bases during his storied career, while Honus Wagner recorded 723 of his own. Each man stole home base more than 25 times, which is incredible to think about, and just generally, the deadball era featured many more daring base runners. Here is Jacoby Ellsbury stealing home for Boston in a game against New York in 2009. The daring play is rare and thrilling when accomplished at the major league level. A good modern question would be, well, how many times did Cobb and Wagner get caught trying to steal a base? Did they have a success rate above 75%? Well, the precise figures are unknown because the number of times caught stealing was intermittently gathered in the early 20th century. But the deadball era was a lower scoring era. Stealing made much more sense on average, and spectators could expect to see 3 to 4 steals per game and many more attempts. This is what John McGraw called scientific baseball, a strategic and methodical approach to the game emphasizing smart, fundamental play over raw athleticism or power hitting. Bunting and stealing when appropriate, winning games with smart defensive positioning and by exploiting pitcher tendencies, outsmarting the other side. McGraw had learned his approach as a third baseman for Ned Hanlon's Baltimore Orioles, which pioneered defensive shifting and new tactics such as the hit and run play. In 1896, they called it inside baseball, and the whole philosophy of inside baseball would shape the major leagues until a series of overlapping developments. In 1920, professional baseball banned spitting on or scuffing the ball. Pressure had mounted from the players and the managers to do away with the unpredictable pitch that some called unfair. Now, that said, Major League Baseball granted an exception to 17 pitchers who had made the spitball their signature pitch before 1920, including the legendary Burleigh Grimes, who played until 1934. So you could see deadball pitching during the early live ball era. On August 16, 1920, Carl Mays, the submarine pitcher, accidentally beamed and killed a player, Ray Chapman, of the Cleveland Indians on a cloudy late afternoon game when the ball was difficult to see. In the aftermath, Major League Baseball decreed that any dirty baseball had to be immediately replaced by a clean white one. Suddenly, hitters could see the ball more clearly than before, and pitchers could no longer miscolor the ball deliberately with dirt on the pitcher's mound. Well, offensive production surged. League batting averages consistently hovered above 280 for over a decade, and teams scored more runs per game. Rogers Hornsby, one of the game's great hitting savants, saw his batting average rise above 400 only after 1920. Not only that, he began to hit 20 to 40 home runs a season. Something had changed. Tris Speaker, one of the greatest outfielders in Major League history, went from hitting 30 or 40 doubles in a single season to hitting more than 50. No one embodies the surge in power more than George Herman Ruth. Even before the banning of spitballs or the removal of dirty balls from play, in 1919, Ruth hit 29 home runs, a record with the Boston Red Sox. He demonstrated the offensive advantage of trying to hit home runs with a massive swing and shift of weight from his back foot to his front foot. Yes, Ruth might strike out 90 times in pursuit of that goal, but the trade-off was obvious. A skilled power hitter could win games by hitting home runs with men on base. Until Babe Ruth, most teams failed to hit 30 home runs in a single season. So in the 1920s, you have modern sluggers like Hornsby and Ruth who could hit for power and average and generate massive offensive numbers. The surge in home runs had major implications for strategy and impacted various facets of the game. Why attempt a stolen base or a sacrifice bunt if the number of extra base hits was surging? And what if a team had two formidable sluggers in the lineup like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig? Two guys that could hit for power and for average. Would you pitch around them, walk them both? The rise of power hitters impacted game strategy and the need for effective relief pitching. There was a growing recognition that some pitchers were better suited for 2 or 3 innings of work rather than 9. Managers found themselves in the middle of a strategic revolution. What was once a low-scoring game dominated by great pitchers such as Walter Johnson and Christy Mathewson was fast becoming a higher-scoring game dominated by great sluggers like Babe Ruth. Managers started thinking more about how to rest their pitchers, when to remove them, and how to deal with sluggers in close games. In short, the way baseball had been played in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was being upended. Now, at the same time, there are many continuities between baseball in 1900 and baseball during the 1920s. Batters still put the ball in play far more than they do today, and they struck out far less. Pete Rose was the last player manager in the 20th century, but that was commonplace in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. In 1924, for instance, Ty Cobb played for and managed the Detroit Tigers. So did Tris Speaker for the Cleveland Indians, and George Sisler, another Hall of Famer, managed the St. Louis Browns. Bucky Harris, just 27 years of age, played for and managed the Washington Senators. The reluctance to strike out is another continuity between the dead ball and early live ball eras. Joe Sewell batted .353 in 1924 and struck out 12 times total. He was the Wee Willie Keeler of 1920s baseball. Where you could see Major League Baseball did not change for decades after the dead ball era ended. It was limited to a handful of northern cities, and most Americans would never see a Major League game because they did not live in a Major League city. And this was, of course, an era before television. Well, what did you see at the ballpark itself? Ballparks at this time were nestled in historic neighborhoods. Here is Cleveland's League Field, Wrigley in Chicago, and Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. You went to a neighborhood for the ball game, not to a suburban parking lot. Spectators were literally closer to the field, and photographers often kneeled along the baselines. What you heard was different from our time. Although electrified public address systems existed in a handful of ballparks, most still relied on the megaphone man to call out player names to the crowd. Spectators could hear the profanity of players, and fans could more easily make their insults to the players known. It was intimate, and it's interesting to see how people are dressed formally at the ballpark. No shorts or tank tops at this time. Here's Aaron Judge slamming into the outfield wall at Dodger Stadium in our time. Thankfully, outfield walls have padding or flexible chain link fences. Babe Ruth knocked himself unconscious and had to receive medical attention after crashing into the outfield wall at Griffith Stadium on July 5, 1924. Outfielders did not have warning tracks or the padded walls of our time. This was an era before batting gloves, elbow braces, or batting helmets. Players wore baggy uniforms and used both hands to field the ball with much smaller gloves. Players, in fact, typically left their gloves in the field when they changed sides to bat. Games lasted approximately 2 hours, and they typically started around 3 in the afternoon. This was a time before artificial lights. If the game went into extra innings, on account of a tie, umpires might have to call it due to the approach of darkness. And this is one reason why doubleheaders occurred so much more frequently at this time, because a game might have a lengthy rain delay and then be suspended on account of darkness. One continuity with the earliest days of professional baseball is that some cities still forbade Sunday games. For example, Boston and Philadelphia did not legalize Sunday baseball games until 1929 and 1934, respectively. The business of professional baseball depended on ticket sales and the number of prospective customers. New York teams had a metro population of 7.5 million in support of their teams, the Yankees, Giants, and Dodgers, while Chicago's metro population exceeded 3 million in support of 2 teams, the Cubs and the White Sox. The Yankees would consistently draw 1 million or more fans during the 1920s. As you might guess, other cities were at a significant disadvantage. St. Louis had 2 teams, the Browns and Cardinals, and just over 1 million fans in its metropolitan zone. Population size was hugely important in an era before streaming rights, television rights, broadcast rights. The gate receipts and concessions were the only sources of revenue. But tickets represented 85% of that revenue. Player salaries were usually 3 times higher than the average worker, and certainly not stratospheric. The Supreme Court of the United States had formally ruled that baseball was not subject to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Teams could hold the contracts of players and compel them to stay with a single team without the possibility of free agency. It was, in effect, a lawful monopoly protected by the highest court in the land. Radios existed in the 1920s, but the newspaper is how people consumed baseball and followed pennant races from coast to coast. At this time in American history, pro baseball had few competitors for the spotlight. Boxing and horse racing had big fan bases. Some Americans followed golf and tennis, but nothing had the broad national appeal of big league ball, and the World Series reigned supreme in the nation's sporting universe. The institution of baseball was unique in that its heroes hailed from western states, southern states, the Great Plains, and the Northeast. Men and women alike followed the major leagues. Truly, it was the national pastime. That said, pro ball reflected the country's racism. Prejudiced white players had refused to take the field with black ball players in the 19th century, and white owners agreed unofficially not to sign black players. So that by the start of the Deadball era, the American and National Leagues were segregated. An unofficial color line existed that would exclude African Americans, if not Native Americans, until 1947. In response to the situation, the African American community organized its own leagues, and in part 3 of this series, I'm going to examine the first Negro League World Series in 1924, which saw the Kansas City Monarchs win their first of many championship titles. So American baseball had the moral corruption of racial segregation, but it also had another type of corruption. Some players threw games for money. In fact, just 1 year after William Hulbert founded the National League, he wound up banning 4 members of the 1877 Louisville Grays for taking money from gamblers. In the years and decades ahead, rumors of crooked players who conspired to fix games circulated periodically, often without definitive evidence, but that all changed in 1920. That year, revelations emerged that certain players on the 1919 White Sox had conspired to lose the World Series. The scandal played out in the press during the 1920 season, and those implicated, although exonerated in Chicago, were banned from baseball for life by a new figure in professional baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Now, Major League owners did not like giving Landis so much authority and control over the game, but they also feared losing public interest in pro baseball if the corruption issue was not dealt with forcefully. And Landis insisted that he would ban anyone who threw games or knew about corruption and did not report it. His mandate was to ensure the game's integrity. In conclusion, many different things made the 1920s such an interesting time in baseball. The strategic revolution arising from the home run hitter occurred alongside spitball pitchers and steals of home base. Heck, Babe Ruth stole home in 1924, and in 1926, Lou Gehrig stole home twice, with Ruth as his partner stealing second base. In 1927, Gehrig stole home 3 times. Continuities from the Deadball era made Major League Baseball fast, rough, powerful, and dynamic. In part 2 of this series, I'm going to look at the 1924 World Series, which nicely illustrates how pro baseball had become the modern game we recognize 100 years later, and yet it possessed certain characteristics that made it, dare I say, superior. Until then, thanks for watching.